A very good morning to you. Today is a good day because I can finally wear my thick cotton t-shirts. The heat wave has passed, which means wearing this will not result in a complete sweaty mess. So that's good news. This video will have 3 separate parts. The first one will be a photo walk around London with the X2DII. I'll also talk about camera settings on the X2DII specifically for street photography, so how I set this camera up and why I use certain settings. And last but not least, we'll be talking about lens pairings. So when I go out, quite often I just have one lens, could be a prime or a zoom, but sometimes I'll have 2 or very rarely 3 lenses, but mostly it's 2. And I just want to talk a bit about how I select which lenses to bring and how I pair them up when I go out with 2. This video is sponsored by Hasselblad, but that's it, let's go and shoot.
He stopped and he was fucking around. Yeah. When you're complaining and nothing's
It's about an hour later and I had to change shirts because what I said earlier about the heat wave and the temperature isn't true, because I guess it was just colder in the morning, like it always is. Anyway, let's talk about camera settings. I'm going to try to keep it brief before I have to change shirts again, but don't worry, I'm not going to do that on camera and scare anyone. So, camera settings. My approach to camera settings is to keep it as simple as possible. And I always shoot either in auto or in aperture shutter priority. I very rarely shoot in manual, and that's for the simple reason that for me manual slows me down. I know many people love to shoot in manual. I think manual is great if you're learning photography and understanding how each part of the triangle works and affects everything else. However, I think once you've mastered manual, at least for me, shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority or even sometimes in program mode just makes my life easier, but of course that's very much personal preference. Most of the time I'll be shooting in aperture priority on this camera, and that's primarily because the aperture has such a huge impact on how the image looks. Being a medium format sensor, if you're shooting at f2.5, you're going to have a lot of parts of the scene out of focus, and these lenses can stop down to like mid to high f20s, so you can get everything pin sharp. So aperture priority is my go-to. Typically I start at f5.6 for normal scenarios. Obviously if it's low light or I specifically want shallow depth of field, I'll go down to f2.5 on this lens, and if I want everything roughly in focus, I'll go to f11, f16 and sometimes even above, but I rarely go above f16 on this camera, at least for my style of photography. The other mode I'm shooting in is shutter priority, and that is if I want to get creative with shutter speed. So if I want to get a bit of motion blur in the scene, if I want to create kind of in-camera movements, that's when shutter priority comes in. It's also extremely useful when shooting at night, because when you're at night, chances are you're already going to be pushing up the ISO and the aperture will already be wide open. So I tend to just lock the shutter speed at, let's say, 1/60th, and then I will see how it goes. The reason for that is that in almost all cameras, even if you've set a specific minimum shutter speed in auto ISO, the camera can still push below that if it's up against the wall with regards to exposure. And if you're not keeping an eye on these settings, you can find yourself shooting at a shutter speed that's a bit lower than what you expect and get out of focus, well, not out of focus, images with unintended motion blur. So by having it in shutter priority when shooting in low light, you ensure that the shutter speed is fixed, and at least if you are up against the wall with your exposure, you'll get an underexposed photo, which is much easier to recover and fix compared to having unintended motion blur, at least in my opinion. Now let's have a look at buttons. So with regards to the buttons, this has a few of them which you can customize. Some of them you can't customize, so we'll work around them. But we will go into the menu under General, Custom Buttons. So I'll start with the front dial. This is the index finger dial. You can push it in, and I have that set to exposure mode cycle. So when I push it in once, it will cycle through aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, etc. For me, it's very convenient. I can just quickly tap it and I can get it into whatever mode I want without actually removing my hand from the shooting position. Moving down, there's a little front button here, and I have that to crop mode cycles, and that will cycle through different crop modes. You can limit how many crop modes you want to use, but we'll talk about crop modes in a little bit. Moving on, we've got this aperture. Well, it's a multi-dial on the lens. You can use it for aperture, you can use it for a bunch of different things. I actually have it switched off, and the primary reason is because on this camera, I like to do the aperture on the index finger, and the rear dial, is for the general exposure, and I can adjust these two one-handed. So I found this, at least for my needs, to be a bit redundant. With that said, if I was shooting in full manual, then this would be set to ISO, at least for me anyway. Moving down, we've got the M button, and that is set to tracking on and off. So when you're shooting continuous autofocus, you can use that to track your subjects. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then the ISO white balance has been reprogrammed to control the focus point and subject detection. For me, I don't really adjust ISO or white balance. Both of them are in auto all the time. However, being able to adjust the focus point and the subject detection settings is more valuable to me. Moving to the back of the camera, the rear thumb dial is obviously used for the exposure, but if I press it in, that is set to reset the exposure compensation. This is a very helpful feature that I wish other cameras had, because let's say if you've underexposed by 2 stops to get a particular creative look, you then switch the camera off, you come back to shoot something else and it's underexposed, and you're fighting to get it back. By pushing it in once, it just resets the exposure to 0. Incredibly helpful. The joystick, you can assign the push function. Now, this one, I've assigned it to reset the focus point back to the center. And I am kind of doubling myself, because on the next to the screen there's a cross button, or the X button, and that also does the same job. However, that can't be reprogrammed. So it feels a bit wasteful to have 2 buttons do the same thing, but I am so used to the joystick resetting the focus point. I've just always done it that way. Also, it's easy to have your finger on the joystick without looking at the camera. You know straight away what feels like a joystick. So I often would reset it as I'm just walking around, and then I can just adjust the focus that way. Obviously, if you're happy using the other button, the cross button, then you can assign this to something else and get an extra button. So there is that. And last but not least is the little function button just below the joystick, and I have that set to focus mode cycle, where I will quickly go through continuous, single and manual focusing. But I'll talk about focusing, as I've said, later on. And that's the button setup. Let's start with crop modes. There are a bunch of different crop modes that you can use on this camera. They give you an overlay of a particular crop. However, that is not baked into the raw file. Instead, when you open it up in Lightroom, for example, you will see a preview of the crop, and then you can punch out, readjust, etc. You can actually limit how many crop modes you want to use. I personally don't use all of them. I only use the expand crop because it's really cool, and for some photos it can look absolutely amazing. And I also use the 3x2 crop, but specifically the cropped in 3x2, which is the 24x36. That gives you a tight, well, not a tight, a very slight crop. So on this lens, which is a 38, it's equivalent to 30mm in full frame. However, with that 3x2 crop, it's more like a 35. So when I shoot on the back of the screen, to my eyes, it's a 35mm focal length. When I open it in Lightroom, it's a 35mm shot. However, if I go into the crop tool, I now have a bit of extra room where I can move around and readjust the composition. For me, 30mm is just a bit too wide for how I like to shoot. 35 is ideal. So this is a really nice way of doing it. All the other modes are switched off, so as I've mentioned earlier, I just use this little front button to quickly cycle between the full sensor, the 3x2 or the expand crop. As for the photos themselves, I only shoot in RAW and in 16-bit. Now you can get great JPEGs out of this camera, you even have a HDR workflow if you want to do that. However, for me, shooting RAW is the only way I photograph, to be honest, because editing is such a huge part of what I do. It makes sense to only shoot in RAW. Moving on to the exposure, I have it set to reset the exposure compensation after the camera reboots. When I'm shooting, I never really turn the camera off. Instead, I just press the power button once, the camera goes to sleep, and then by tapping the shutter button, it wakes up instantly, so I'm not wasting time waiting for the camera to boot up. However, when I switch it off, it's probably because I know I'm not going to use it for a while, and I have it set to reset the exposure compensation during that reboot, because chances are it'll be a long period between shooting and I just don't want to switch it on and then have to make these adjustments myself. Now, you have electronic shutter. I personally don't use it because you have a great leaf shutter in the camera, so there is just no need for it, at least for me. Shutter speed limit, when I'm shooting in aperture priority, you can set a minimum shutter speed. I've set it to 500. Now that might seem like a lot, but if you have to think about it, it's a 100 megapixel file. Therefore, any motion blur or any unintentional camera movement will just be so much more visible the higher the resolution the camera is. And this is especially true when I'm shooting with the 90mm lens, which is even longer. So by having it set so high, I am ensuring that I'm not getting these issues. Okay, the ISO might be pushed up a bit, but I would much rather deal with a bit of noise, which is very easily manageable in this camera, rather than, ruin a shot. And as I maybe mentioned earlier, if I'm shooting at night, I'll be flicking it into shutter priority anyway, so I'm not worried about minimum shutter speeds. And then as for the auto ISO limits, I just have it on minimum and maximum, as in I've got 50 on the minimum and 12,800 on the maximum. That always worked for me, don't really need anything else. Now let's look at focusing. So there are three main focus modes on this camera. There's continuous, single and manual. Let's start with manual because you have two ways of using manual. The easiest way is if you have a lens with this ring, you can just flick it into manual and then you can use it as a manual focus lens. The other way is to, if you like I've assigned this button, you can press it and you can get into manual that way. If you do it using the camera, not the lens, you can then use the AFD button to autofocus, and then when you let go, it goes back into manual. This is the mode that I use if I want to focus and lock. So for example, I'm fishing a scene, I see something, I flick it into manual, I pre-focus, it's locked, and I don't have to worry about the camera refocusing. I can just fire off photos without a problem. So it's good for that. Now, if I want to actually shoot in manual and always adjust the manual focus, then I will just flick the lens into manual. And I will lose the other feature, but at least I'll get a more tactile manual experience. The AFC, which is continuous autofocus, that's my setting for when I'm walking around town and there's a lot of motion going on. I'm taking photos of things that are moving or perhaps unmoving. That's where the AFC is great for that, because then you are tracking any differences. And on this camera, it's good enough where you could easily just leave it on AFC and not have to worry about it too much. Finally, you have AFS, which is traditional single autofocus. You half press, it's locked, you can recompose and do that. I tend not to use that as much because what I found is I would rather just use the back button in manual and do it that way, or just go full continuous autofocus. But obviously for you, it might be a bit different. Moving on to focus points, there are 3 to choose from, or 3 that I use at least. So you have a very tiny square. Now this will be the slowest to focus because it's looking at a very tiny area, but it will be the most precise. So if you're doing, let's say, architecture, still life, portraiture where the subject is still and you don't want to rely on the auto features, that will be good for that. There's one in the middle, which is like an expanding spot. So it's a small square with a larger square around it. It just gives you a bit more room to breathe with regards to the focusing. That's the one that I use most of the time. And then you have a custom zone. I've set it to a slightly larger square, and I tend to use this if I'm out in nature and if I am focusing on something roughly over there. So cityscapes, nature, that kind of stuff. And it's great for that. But most of the time, I am just in the middle one with the small square and the larger square around it. Okay, that's the summary of how I set up the X2DII for my photography. Of course, if you have any questions, please ask them below, but this covers just about everything. This is the third shirt change of the day. I'm gonna stick with the cotton shirts because I'm just so sick of wearing gym clothes, and the linen stuff needs ironing. It just looks like a cow has been chewing it, so should be all right. The window is closed because obviously the noise, and anyway, I'm waffling. Let's talk about lens pairings. So as maybe I've said at the start of the video, in most cases these days I go out with just one lens. That could be a 24-70 zoom. It could be a 35mm prime or a 50, or I generally just to try and keep it to one lens. And that is to avoid situations where you're constantly between lenses, you're switching, and it's just not a fun place to be. If I go back 6-7 years, I would go out with 3-4 different lenses. I'll have a 24-70, I'll have a 70-200, I'll have a fast 35 prime, and maybe like even a little manual focus lens for fun. And what I found is that I would very often be in my own head about which lens I should be using. So I could be shooting this at 24-70, but then all of a sudden, oh, I need 70-200, I'll just quickly switch it over. And it's just the whole cycle is just a mess. There were two clear scenarios. So the first one, I was shooting for a tourism board, and I went out with about 3-4 different lenses in my bag, and it was just a nightmare. This was many, many years ago, and I just hated myself for it. And then when I was in Lisbon a few years ago, I had 4 different primes on me. Don't ask why, I had 4 primes, and I'm pretty sure every single time I went to take a photo, I was wishing I had a different prime on the camera. So by the time I switch it over, the moment is gone. So as time went on, I've gone down to just 1 prime. However, now and again, especially if I'm traveling, I'll bring 2 primes. And this is basically how I go about picking the focal length. So the first thing I wouldn't do is I would never pick 2 lenses which are next to each other. So for example, I wouldn't go out with a 28 and a 35, because the 28 is easy to crop to a 35 and they're too close together. If I have a 28, the other lens would have to be a 50, because there is enough of a gap in order for the lens swap to be easily justifiable. So if you can take the same photo on the 28 and the 35, then they're kind of cancelling each other out. Whereas a 28 and a 50, they're 2 very different images, and it'll be pretty obvious which lens you need to use for that particular scenario. If I'm going out with a zoom, I might bring a little pancake lens, but with a zoom, typically it's just 1 lens. It's not really a thing. On the Hasselblad system, I have a lot more flexibility because of the resolution, and because the lenses are so sharp, I can crop in significantly. So this on the camera is the 38, and this is the 90. Last month, or in May, when I was doing the big trip with this camera, these are the only 2 lenses that I brought with me. These are the only 2 lenses that I have for the system. And even though they have a zoom and they have many other lenses, I only wanted these 2 because they cover the entire range. Plus, when you crop in, you can get a lot more out of them. So the 38 is around 30mm in full frame terms. And let's just say 28, 30, it's about the same. You get in a wide angle shot, you get everything you want. And the 90, that's a bit closer to a 70mm, maybe 67, 68, something like that. When I was out shooting, it would be very clear which lens I need to use, because you're getting 2 very different images. And very rarely did I think, oh, I need this lens, oh, I need that lens. Maybe once or twice when there was a lot going on in Istanbul. But for the most part, it was very obvious which lens had to be used, and the other lens was in the bag. So if I can give any advice on pairing lenses, try to do it in a way that each lens has a very clear purpose and there isn't too much overlap. Because otherwise, yeah, it's just not going to be very fun. I've been there many times. I would still suggest 1 lens is the ideal to bring with you, but if you need to, then maybe a wide and a tight, and keep it at that.